Renee and Andrew McCrae. The first case is Renee and Andrew McCrae, a young mother and her 3-year-old son who drove out of Inverness on a November evening in 1976 and were never seen again. For 46 years, their bodies stayed missing. The man who took them carried a secret nobody ever knew. What was he hiding? And how did one of Scotland's oldest cold cases finally collapse under its own weight? Christina McCrae, known to everyone as Renee, was 36 years old. She was separated from her husband, Inverness builder Gordon McCrae, and was the mother of 2 sons, an older boy named Gordon Jr. and a 3-year-old named Andrew. Renee had been quietly living a parallel life for 4 years. She had been having a relationship with William Bill McDowell, the company secretary at her estranged husband's business, Hugh McCrae Builders Limited. Almost nobody knew. Her best friend, Valerie Steventon, was the only person Renee had ever confided in. On the evening of November 12, 1976, Renee told her family she was driving south to Kilmarnock to visit her sister. She loaded her 3-year-old son, Andrew, into her BMW and drove out of Inverness. She had no intention of going to Kilmarnock. She was driving to meet Bill McDowell. Later that night, a train driver passing along the A9 road saw something on fire in a lay-by near Dalmagary. He stopped. It was Renee's burnt-out BMW. There was no sign of Renee. There was no sign of 3-year-old Andrew. The investigation that followed stretched on for decades. Northern Constabulary named McDowell as a suspect in a 2006 report to the Crown Office. The Crown declined to prosecute, citing insufficient evidence. A formal cold case reinvestigation began in 2017 under Police Scotland's Major Investigations Team. Investigators spent £122,000 excavating Dalmagary Quarry. They drained Leonash Quarry near Inverness in 2019. Could 2 people simply vanish in northern Scotland with no trace at all? In September 2019, William McDowell was arrested in Cumbria, England. He was extradited north for trial. At the High Court in Inverness, the case prosecutors built was both circumstantial and damning. They presented evidence that McDowell had removed and burned the boot floor of his company Volvo 2 days after Renee and Andrew disappeared. They read statements from a now-deceased witness named Dennis Tyrani, who had told police McDowell had once offered him £500 to kill Renee and Andrew in an acid attack. And the prosecution told the jury something only a small handful of people had ever known. The 3-year-old child William McDowell had killed alongside Renee was his own biological son. Advocate Depute Alex Prentice KC put it to the jury in the simplest terms. He told them, life for Bill McDowell would change dramatically if it all came out in the open. He would lose his job, his family, and his home. That, prosecutors argued, was the motive. Renee had been pressing him to leave his marriage. Andrew was the living evidence of the affair. And so, on a November night in 1976, William McDowell had chosen the only way out that would protect everything else he had built. On September 29, 2022, William McDowell was convicted at the High Court in Inverness. Lord Armstrong sentenced him to life with a 30-year punishment part. By that point, he was 80 years old. The conviction came 46 years after Renee and Andrew had last been seen. The verdict did not bring an end to the search for Renee and Andrew. McDowell took the locations of their bodies to his own grave. On February 15, 2023, less than 6 months into his sentence, William McDowell died in prison without ever revealing where Renee and Andrew were. Police Scotland confirmed in 2024 that the physical search continues Detective Chief Inspector Brian Geddes told the Press and Journal the case will never be considered resolved until we find Renee and Andrew. On March 25, 2026, Suzanne's Law came into force, creating a new statutory framework for parole consideration in Scottish no-body killings. But for the McRae family, the law arrived too late for the man who had taken everything from them. While one Scottish family was still waiting for the return of a mother and a child, another set of parents would spend nearly 40 years waiting for a single fresh forensic profile to finally name the man who killed two 17-year-olds in a single night. World's End Murders. The next case is one of Scotland's most infamous cold case files, the World's End Murders. Two 17-year-old young women who had been celebrating the start of their adult lives walked out of an Edinburgh pub on a Saturday night in 1977. By the next morning, both were dead. The case sat unsolved for nearly 4 decades, and the legal failure that followed eventually rewrote Scottish law itself. How does a country change one of its oldest legal principles because of two young women who never made it home? Christine Eadie and Helen Scott were both 17 years old. They had been friends at Firhill High School in Edinburgh and had each only recently started their first jobs. On Saturday, October 15th, 1977, they joined two other friends, Jacqueline Inglis and a young woman known by the first name Tony, for a pub crawl down the Royal Mile in Edinburgh. The four ended the night at the World's End pub on the High Street, a Royal Mile location that would later give the case its permanent name. Around 11:15 that night, Christine and Helen were last seen leaving the pub with two men. They were spotted by an off-duty police officer, PC John Rafferty, who happened to know Christine. The next morning, Christine Eadie's body was found in the dunes at Gosford Bay, East Lothian. She had been bound and gagged. 4 hours later, Helen Scott's body was found 6 miles inland in a cornfield near Haddington. Both women had been beaten, harmed, and strangled with their own clothing. Lothian and Borders Police took more than 13,000 statements from the public. They listed over 500 named suspects through the end of 1977. The case went cold. In 1997, 20 years after the killings, the Cold Case Unit obtained a male DNA profile from both victims. The profile matched no one in any available database. In 2004, forensic scientists obtained a full fresh DNA profile from Helen Scott's coat. This time the profile matched a man named Angus Sinclair, who was already serving life at HMP Peterhead for an unrelated case. Sinclair was charged. So was his deceased brother-in-law, Gordon Hamilton, whom investigators believed had been the second man in the pub that night. The first trial in 2007 became one of the most controversial moments in modern Scottish legal history. Judge Lord Clark accepted a defense submission of no case to answer and threw the case out before the jury could consider it. The decision sparked national outrage. Two young women's families had waited 30 years for a trial. The Scottish legal system had ended it before they ever saw a verdict. What followed was extraordinary. On March 22, 2011, the Scottish Parliament passed the Double Jeopardy Scotland Act, which allowed for the retrial of an accused person in defined circumstances, where the original verdict had been an acquittal. The law was passed in direct response to the failure of the first Sinclair trial. The retrial began in 2014. Forensic soil scientist Professor Lorna Dawson examined soil samples taken from Helen Scott's bare feet for the prosecution. The DNA evidence was reinforced by physical and trace evidence. On November 14, 2014, at the High Court in Livingston, after a 5-week trial, the jury returned a guilty verdict in under 2.5 hours. Lord Matthews addressed Sinclair from the bench he said, "You have displayed not 1 ounce of remorse for these terrible deeds. The evidence in this case, as well as your record, details of which have now been revealed, shows that you are a dangerous predator who is capable of sinking to the depths of depravity." He sentenced Sinclair to a minimum tariff of 37 years. That is the longest minimum tariff ever imposed in Scottish legal history. Angus Sinclair died at HMP Glenorchill on March 11, 2019, aged 73. He remains suspected by Police Scotland of at least 3 other unsolved killings across his lifetime. The 2 17-year-olds who walked out of the World's End pub had forced an entire country to rewrite its own legal foundations. The Double Jeopardy Scotland Act now stands as the formal legal legacy of Christine Eadie and Helen Scott. Applied since then to other cold cases across Scotland, where new evidence has emerged after an acquittal. While one Edinburgh case rewrote Scottish law in pursuit of justice, the next would expose how a Scottish police force had handed a man 19 years of freedom by simply choosing not to look at him. Emma Caldwell. The next case is Emma Caldwell. And what makes this story unlike any other in Scottish criminal history is not just what happened to her. It is what happened after. For 19 years, the man who had taken her life was on the police force's own list of interviewed witnesses. They had spoken to him within weeks. They had let him go. And while they spent £4 million prosecuting the wrong men, that same man kept harming women. How does a Scottish police force lose a killer who had been sitting in front of them? Emma Caldwell was 27 years old. She came from a close-knit family in Erskine. She had developed a heroin addiction following the death of her sister and was funding it through sex work in Glasgow. In the days before her death, she had spoken to her mother, Margaret. She had told her she was hoping to enter rehabilitation. On Monday, April 4th, 2005, Emma was last captured on CCTV around 11 o'clock at night, walking along Butterbiggins Road toward Victoria Road. She did not come home. Her family reported her missing on April 11th. On Sunday, May 8th, her body was found in Limefield Woods near Biggar, South Lanarkshire. In June 2005, Strathclyde police interviewed a man named Ian Packer. He was a taxi driver. During his interview, Packer admitted to investigators that he had taken sex workers, including Emma, to Limefield Woods, the exact place where her body had been found. He was let go. Investigators then turned their full attention elsewhere. They spent the next several years building a case against 4 Turkish men. That prosecution went ahead in 2007. It collapsed when the case was dismissed. The total cost to the Scottish public was roughly £4 million. None of the 4 men had anything to do with Emma's death. Their lives, their reputations, and their immigration status had all been damaged by a prosecution Strathclyde police had never had the right evidence for. Ian Packer was still free, and he kept harming women. Could an entire Scottish police force really not see what was happening year after year while the file on Emma sat closed? The case might have remained that way forever if it had not been for journalism. In 2015, the Sunday Mail published an investigation led by editor Jim Wilson that publicly exposed Ian Packer's name. The reaction from Police Scotland was not gratitude. The force launched an unlawful probe to identify the newspaper's sources. It was only after that probe collapsed and Lord Advocate Frank Mulholland intervened that the original murder case was officially reopened. The forensic work that followed was meticulous. In 2021, a soil sample taken from the location where Emma's body had been found was compared to soil samples from Packer's blue work van. The match was striking. Dr. Stefan Uytehage of the Netherlands Forensic Institute in The Hague gave palynology testimony. The court was told that the soil from the van was a 97% match with the soil from the place where Emma's body had been found. Packer was charged in February 2022. The trial took place at the High Court in Glasgow. On February 28, 2024, Ian Packer was convicted of murdering Emma Caldwell. He was also convicted of 11 rapes and a total of 33 charges against 22 victims. He was sentenced to life with a 36-year minimum. That is the second longest minimum tariff in Scottish legal history, behind only Angus Sinclair's 37 years. The Emma Caldwell Public Inquiry, chaired by Lord Scott, formally opened on December 9, 2025. Family solicitor Amer Anwar has demanded the inquiry's remit extend beyond Strathclyde Police to scrutinise Police Scotland after 2013. Packer lost his appeal against sentence in 2024 for 19 years. While a Scottish police force pursued the wrong men with £4 million, Ian Packer had been left to harm 11 more women. And if you have made it this far and enjoy content like this, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you do not miss what comes next. Emma Caldwell's mother, Margaret, has lived to see his conviction. The inquiry that will examine how the police force let him slip away is now underway. While one Glasgow case finally exposed 19 years of police failure, the next would be even more difficult to look at, because in Nairn, the file remains open. Alistair Wilson. The next case is Alistair Wilson, the Scottish bank manager shot dead on the doorstep of his own home in Nairn on a Sunday evening in 2004. A man with a baseball cap, a blue envelope with one name written on it, a 1930s pocket pistol, and for over 20 years, no arrest. So who knocked on Alistair Wilson's door that November night? And why does this case still sit completely unsolved? Alistair Wilson was 30 years old. He was a business manager at the Nairn branch of the Bank of Scotland. He lived at Crescent Road with his wife Veronica and their 2 young sons. Veronica's father lived in the top-floor flat of the same building. It was, by every account, the kind of home Alistair and Veronica had built quietly together. At approximately 7 o'clock on the evening of Sunday, November 28, 2004, Veronica answered her front door. A man was standing there. He was wearing a baseball cap, a dark jacket, and jeans. He asked by name for Alistair. Alistair came down the stairs. The man handed him a blue envelope. On the outside of the envelope was a single word, the name Paul. Alistair took the envelope, went back inside briefly, and then returned to the door. The man at the doorstep took out a pistol and shot Alistair dead on his own threshold. The weapon used became one of the strangest pieces of physical evidence in modern Scottish criminal history. It was found 10 days later in a nearby storm drain. The pistol was a Heinel Schmeisser pocket pistol manufactured in Germany in the 1930s. It was a collector's item, almost a museum piece. Could a doorstep killing of a young father in a small town really have been carried out with a weapon that nobody outside a small circle of enthusiasts would have known how to find? The investigation that followed became one of the largest in Scottish history. The early theory focused on Alistair's banking work. Detectives investigated whether his employment as a Bank of Scotland manager had drawn the attention of some criminal interest. They examined every account he had ever handled. Nothing came back. The theory then shifted. Investigators began to focus on a far more local possibility. Alistair had recently been engaged in a personal dispute with the Havelock Hotel directly across from his home. On November 25, 2004, 3 days before he was killed, He had formally objected to a planned decking area at the hotel. In May 2023, Police Scotland's major investigation team prepared to arrest a suspect. The operation was, at the last possible moment, cancelled by the Crown Office. What happened next caused a public scandal that has not yet ended. The Scottish Police Authority later upheld complaints that Deputy Chief Constable Bex Smith had provided false information to Veronica Wilson and her son Andrew in meetings in September and October 2023. Detective Chief Superintendent Paul Livingstone was also found to have lied about whether an arrest date had ever been identified. In September 2024, Lord Advocate Dorothy Bain KC announced a full reinvestigation of the killing. The investigation was given a name: Operation Sabine. As confirmed by Police Scotland's November 28, 2024 statement, Detective Chief Superintendent Suzanne Chow is the Strategic Senior Investigating Officer. The team has since expanded to 37 officers and staff. Chow stated publicly, "I am determined that the passage of time is no barrier to justice, and we are absolutely committed to finding out who was responsible and bringing them to justice." Alistair Wilson's son, Andrew, who was a young boy when his father was killed on the doorstep, has grown up and become one of the most public voices in the campaign for answers. In interviews with the press and journal, he has accused the original investigators of kicking the can down the road, while the suspect his family believes was responsible has continued walking northern Scotland. As of today, no arrests have been made. No charges have been filed. A 1930s pocket pistol pulled from a storm drain still sits in evidence. A blue envelope with one name on it has never been linked to anyone outside Alistair's own life. And on Crescent Road in Nairn, the door he opened on a November Sunday in 2004 still stands. While one Scottish town still waits for an arrest in a doorstep execution, the next case carries us to a stretch of woodland near Dundee, where two young women, 11 months apart, vanished into the same trees. Templeton Woods Murders. The next case is one Scotland has never been able to close. Two young women, 11 months apart, both vanishing from Dundee nightlife, both found in the same stretch of woodland. The trial of one man ended in acquittal. The other case has never seen anyone charged at all. Are the Templeton Woods killings the work of one man? Or are they two separate tragedies that happen to share the same stretch of trees? Carol Lannon was 18 years old. She was a mother of a 3-month-old baby. On the evening of March 20th, 1979, she was last seen in Dundee's Exchange Street in the city's red light district. A witness reported seeing her get into a red estate car. It was possibly a Ford Cortina. The next morning, a walking couple found her naked, strangled body in Templeton Woods. 11 days later, on April 1st, 1979, her handbag and clothing were discovered on the banks of the River Don in Aberdeenshire. The personal items had traveled 85 miles from where her body had been left. 11 months later, the second case began. Elizabeth McCabe was 20 years old. She was a trainee nursery nurse. On February 10, 1980, after a night at Teaser's Disco in central Dundee, she vanished. For 16 days, her family did not know what had happened to her. On February 26, 1980, the day she would have turned 21, rabbit hunters working through Templeton Woods discovered her partly clothed body. She was found only 150 yards from where Carol Lannon had been found 11 months earlier. Like Carol, she had been strangled. The investigation eventually narrowed in on a Dundee taxi driver named Vincent Simpson, who had openly admitted being in Templeton Woods on the night Elizabeth McCabe had vanished. He had been there, he said, as a peeping Tom. In 2007, after DNA recovered from Elizabeth's clothing showed a 1 in 40 million probability of belonging to anyone else, Simpson was put on trial. The case went to a jury at the High Court. In December 2007, the defense brought in their own experts to attack the reliability of the DNA trace. The jury, by majority verdict, acquitted Vincent Simpson. Police said afterward that they were not seeking anyone else for Elizabeth McCabe's killing. So where did that leave the rest of the file? The years that followed have produced one of the most enduring debates in Scottish true crime. Author Alexander McGregor, in his book The Law Killers, and the 2023 Channel 4 documentary In the Footsteps of Killers, presented by Amelia Fox, both pointed to one credible suspect for both Templeton Woods killings. His name was Andrew Hunter. Hunter was a former social worker. In 1988, he strangled his second wife, Linda, in Ladybank, Fife. He had also driven a red Ford Cortina at the relevant time. And he had professionally worked with Carol Lannon before her death. Hunter was investigated. He had been a known person of interest for years. He died in prison before any new Scottish case could be brought against him for Carol or Elizabeth. Investigators have also examined a far more notorious figure. The serial killer Angus Sinclair, the same man eventually convicted of the World's End murders, was investigated under Operation Trinity in relation to the Templeton Woods killings. He was conclusively eliminated. Whoever killed Carol Lannon and Elizabeth McCabe was not Angus Sinclair. What makes the Templeton Woods file particularly painful for the families involved is that Police Scotland has not officially linked the two killings. They remain on paper two separate unsolved homicides that happened to take place in the same wood 11 months apart. Two young women, both connected to Dundee nightlife. Both strangled, both left in the same 150-yard stretch of woodland. Former Criminal Investigation Department officer Les Liney spoke to STV News at the 40th anniversary of Carol Lannon's death. He told reporters simply, "There's always the chance that someone out there knows something that could lead the police to the killers." For the families of Carol Lannon and Elizabeth McCabe, that hope has carried them across more than 4 decades. Both files remain officially open as of today. While one Scottish wood still holds the secrets of 2 young women, the next case carries us into an Elgin household where a wife disappeared on the same morning she had an appointment with a divorce solicitor. Arlene Fraser. The next case is Arlene Fraser, a Moray mother who waved her children off to school on a quiet April morning in 1998 and never made it through the rest of the day. Her body has never been found. The man convicted of taking her life has been convicted twice and walks Scottish appeal courts to this day. So what makes this case one of the most extraordinary in Scottish legal history? Arlene Fraser was 33 years old. She was the mother of 2 and lived in New Elgin in Moray. By April 1998, her marriage to her husband Nat Fraser, an Elgin fishmonger, had broken down completely. Nat Fraser had a documented history. He had assaulted Arlene in March 1998 and had served 18 months for that offense. Arlene had separated from him afterward. On the morning she disappeared, she had a scheduled appointment with a divorce solicitor. On April 28, 1998, between 9:41 in the morning and a short time afterward, Arlene waved her children off to school. She was still in her dressing gown. That was the last time anyone she loved saw her alive. By the time her children returned home that afternoon, she was gone. Her body has never been recovered. The investigation that followed was unlike almost any other in modern Scottish criminal history. Prosecutors did not have a body. They did not have a clearly defined crime scene. What they had was a series of details that, taken together, pointed at one man. Days after Arlene disappeared, her wedding and engagement rings reappeared in her bathroom. The prosecution argued that this could only have happened if someone with intimate knowledge of the household had returned and placed them there. CCTV evidence was interpreted by forensic lip reader Tina Lannon, and accomplice evidence was given by a man named Hector Dick, who described in detail what he believed had happened. The prosecution argued that Nat Fraser had killed Arlene to avoid losing roughly £250,000 in a divorce. Could a man really plan that calculation while his wife was still alive? In 2003, Nat Fraser was convicted of his wife's killing. He was sentenced to a minimum of 25 years in prison. For the family of Arlene, who still did not know where she was, the verdict was both a measure of relief and a wound that nothing could close. Then, in 2008, that conviction was overturned on appeal and a retrial was ordered. What followed was a rare moment in Scottish legal history. In 2011, the UK Supreme Court quashed Fraser's original conviction over undisclosed evidence about the wedding rings. The Supreme Court rarely intervenes in Scottish murder cases. Their judgment opened the door to a full retrial. That retrial began in 2012. It was nearly derailed when a witness accidentally mentioned in open court that Fraser had been in prison previously. The defense raised what has become known in Scottish legal circles as the Google factor, the modern reality that any juror with a phone in their pocket can find information they are not supposed to access. The retrial continued. Nat Fraser was convicted a second time. He was sentenced to a minimum of 17 years. Lord Carloway refused his appeal on October 4, 2013. Today, Nat Fraser remains incarcerated. He is reported to be held at HM Prison Addywell. He has exhausted his domestic appeals. He has also taken his case to the European Court of Human Rights. None of those routes has reopened his conviction. And yet, what has changed in the years since his conviction is the legal landscape in which his future parole consideration will take place. On March 25, 2026, Suzanne's Law came into force in Scotland. The law is the parole provision of the Victims, Witnesses, and Justice Reform Scotland Act, which received royal assent on October 30, 2025. Justice Secretary Angela Constance, when announcing the commencement of the law, explicitly named Arlene Fraser's family alongside the families of Suzanne Pilley and Margaret Fleming. The new law directs the parole board to consider, when making any decision on release, whether a prisoner has information about the disposal of a victim's remains and has not disclosed it. For the Fraser family, the law arrived after 27 years of waiting to know where Arlene is. While one Moray case waits to see whether new parole law will force a long silent killer to speak, the next case has been the subject of one of the loudest innocence campaigns in modern Scottish criminal history. Jodi Jones. The next case is Jodi Jones, a 14-year-old killed in Woodland near Dalkeith in June 2003. The young man convicted of her killing was barely older than she was. For more than 2 decades, he has maintained his innocence. The campaign for his release has reached every level of Scottish public life. And in February 2025, a Court of Session judge ruled on the latest legal challenge in his case. So who actually walked into those woods that night? And does the conviction stand on solid ground? Jodi Jones was 14 years old. She lived with her family in East Houses near Dalkeith. She had been in a relationship with Luke Mitchell, also 14, for some time before her death. Mitchell had recently adopted what was widely described in coverage as a goth-styled appearance. Friends and classmates knew he was a cannabis user. On the evening of June 30, 2003, Jody failed to return home. The path she had been walking down was a familiar one, a route she had taken many times to meet Luke. Later that night, Luke Mitchell himself led the search party to her body. He told the others present that his dog had found her behind a wall in Woodland. That decision, to be the one to lead the search to the location, became one of the most heavily debated pieces of the entire case in the years that followed. A 10-month investigation by Lothian and Borders Police led to Luke Mitchell's arrest on April 14, 2004. He was 15 years old when he was taken into custody. The trial took place at the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh. The prosecution case was largely circumstantial. It relied on testimony from Luke's brother, which undermined Luke's stated alibi. It included eyewitness accounts, and it leaned heavily on the prior knowledge argument that the way Mitchell had located Jody's body could not be explained unless he had already known it was there. By agreement between the Crown and the defense, DNA evidence was deemed neutral. Luke and Jody had been in a relationship. Mitchell's DNA was on Jody's bra. Hers was on his trousers. Neither finding could move the case in either direction. There was, however, one piece of evidence that mattered more than almost any other, and that evidence no longer exists. Luke Mitchell's coat, which had been seized as a potentially crucial production, was destroyed by police. No later forensic testing of that coat will ever be possible. Could a single piece of evidence destroyed at the police end of the chain of custody really have rewritten everything? On January 21, 2005, Luke Mitchell was convicted at the High Court in Edinburgh. He was 14 at the time of the killing, among the youngest convicted of murder in modern Scottish history. On February 11, 2005, Lord Nimmo Smith sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 20 years. The case has not gone quiet. The Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission reviewed Mitchell's conviction in July 2014. The review found that his rights under Article 6 of the European Convention on Human Rights had been breached because he had been interviewed without a lawyer. The SCCRC nonetheless ruled the conviction safe. The review also acknowledged something that has remained at the center of the Innocence campaign ever since. There was unknown male semen recovered from Jody's clothing that has never been identified. Mitchell became eligible for parole in April 2024. His first parole application was refused. He then sought judicial review of the parole board's decision. Lady Haldane heard the case on February 6, 2025, at the Court of Session. On February 19, 2025, she refused his petition. Lady Haldane ruled that there is no objective justification for concluding that the procedure adopted in this case was unfair. His scheduled April 2025 parole hearing was postponed at the request of his own legal team, with no new date yet set. Luke Mitchell continues to maintain his innocence. Campaigners Sandra Lean and Scott Forbes have submitted a petition to Holyrood seeking an independent inquiry into the case. The Jones family has endured sustained online abuse from his supporters over many years. Both sides of this case continue to argue from positions they have held for over 2 decades. While one Scottish case remains the subject of one of the most divisive innocence debates in the country, the next would carry across the Vale of Leven, where 4-year-old eyes saw something nobody else did. Caroline Glatchon. The next case is Caroline Glatchon, a 14-year-old whose name sat inside a Scottish cold case file for nearly 28 years. The young man she went to meet on a summer night in 1996 denied any involvement for almost 3 decades. The witness who eventually helped convict 3 of his peers had been 4 years old at the time. How does a 4-year-old's memory hold up nearly 3 decades later? And what kind of teenage relationship ends in this kind of killing? Caroline Glachon was 14 years old. She lived in Bon Hill with her mother, Margaret McKeach. Caroline was a fourth-year pupil at Our Lady in St. Patrick's High in Dumbarton. According to evidence at trial, she was described as infatuated with 18-year-old Robert O'Brien. O'Brien was simultaneously in a relationship with another young woman, Donna Marie Brand. The Vale of Leven, where all three lived, was a small enough place that the dynamics between them had become part of the local atmosphere of late August 1996. Late on the night of August 24th, Caroline left a friend's house on the Ladyton estate. She was on her way to meet Robert O'Brien at the Black Bridge over the River Leven near midnight. She walked alone. She never returned. The next day, August 25, 1996, a passerby found Caroline's partly submerged body in the river at Place of Bon Hill in Renton. That day was her mother Margaret's 40th birthday. The forensic findings were detailed. Caroline had suffered at least 10 blows to the head and extensive skull fractures. Forensic pathologist Dr. Marjorie Turner later testified at trial that the ultimate cause of Caroline's death was drowning. She had still been alive at the time she went into the water, although unconscious. Could a 14-year-old, on her way to meet her teenage crush at a riverside bridge, really have ended up in those waters at the hands of people her own age? The case went cold for 27 years. Police Scotland's major investigation team reopened the file in 2019. What they pieced together was that on the night of August 24, 1996, Caroline had not gone to the bridge alone. 3 teenagers had been involved in her death: Robert O'Brien himself, Andrew Kelly, and Donna Marie Brand. A fourth potential suspect, Sarah Jane O'Neill, who had been Andrew Kelly's girlfriend, had died in 2019 before any charges could be brought. The trial heard evidence that Robert O'Brien had threatened to kill Caroline beforehand for kissing another boy. But the key witness who tied the case together had been a 4-year-old child at the time. His name was Archie Wilson, and he had been present near the scene of the killing. Archie's testimony, given as an adult about something he had witnessed as a 4-year-old, was that Andrew Kelly had thrown rocks at Caroline. The court accepted his memory as credible evidence. On December 14, 2023, at the High Court in Glasgow, all 3 teenagers, now adults, were convicted. The verdict came nearly 28 years to the day after Caroline's body had been found. Lord Braid handed down the sentencing in January 2024. Donna Marie Brand was sentenced separately in April 2024. Robert O'Brien received a minimum tariff of 22 years. Andrew Kelly received 18 years. Donna Marie Brand received 17 years. Lord Braid described the killing in stark terms. He called it a brutal, depraved, and above all wicked murder, and addressed Robert O'Brien directly. He told him, "You have taken a daughter from a loving mother. No sentence that I pass could possibly make up for what she has lost." Brand and Kelly both appealed. The Court of Criminal Appeal refused both appeals on January 16, 2025, in a decision cited as 2025 HC Jack 6. Robert O'Brien had earlier been refused leave to appeal at his own stage. For the family of Caroline Glachon, the wait of 27 years had finally ended. The 4-year-old who had witnessed something nobody else did had grown up to give the evidence that closed the loop. Caroline's mother, Margaret, who had spent the morning of her 40th birthday in 1996 receiving the news no parent ever wants, lived long enough to watch the 3 convicted teenagers, now adults, escorted out of a Scottish courtroom. While one Scottish riverside case closed almost 3 decades after a 14-year-old's last walk, The next would unfold in an entirely modern context. An online profile, a retired teacher, and a suitcase driven across the English border. Peter Koshan. The next case is Dr. Peter Koshan, a retired biology teacher from one of Scotland's most prestigious schools who in 2022 became the target of one of the most carefully arranged online schemes in recent Scottish criminal history. By the time he was reported missing, he had already been in a suitcase, in a lay-by, in England. So what does it take to lure a vulnerable retired teacher with Parkinson's into a flat he was never going to leave? Dr. Peter Koshan was 75 years old. He had taught biology at Fettes College in Edinburgh from 1972 through 2005, a tenure that overlapped with the school years of one of its most well-known former pupils, future Prime Minister Tony Blair. Peter had run the school's Duke of Edinburgh award scheme for 33 years. He lived at South Learmonth Gardens near Stockbridge in Edinburgh. 5 years before his death, he had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. On the night of August 11, 2022, Peter was last seen on a street called Seafield Road in Leith, in Edinburgh, around 11:50 in the evening. He was reported missing the following day, August 12th. For weeks, no one knew where he was. The search expanded across Edinburgh and into the surrounding areas. The case stretched on. 24 days after he was last seen, on September 4th, 2022, Peter's body was found. It had been left more than 80 miles from Edinburgh, in a lay-by on the A696 near the village of Kirk Welpington, in Northumberland, England. What investigators eventually pieced together became one of the most disturbing scams ever to result in a Scottish murder conviction. A man named Paul McNaughton, who was 29 years old, had met Peter Koshan online via the dating app Gaydar in 2021. McNaughton had used a fake profile. From that fake first contact, McNaughton had progressively defrauded Peter out of tens of thousands of pounds across the months that followed. When Peter threatened to go to the police, McNaughton acted with a flatmate named Paul Black, who was 65 years old and who also used the name Joseph Hillary. The two men lured Peter to their flat on Seafield Road on the night of August 11th. McNaughton later admitted putting a bag over Peter's head to suffocate him. Could a 75-year-old man with Parkinson's really have been hunted in this way? From a profile photograph all the way to a suitcase across a national border. What the two men did next was carefully planned. The body was hidden in the flat for several days. Between August 14th and 15th, McNaughton and Black went out and bought items they would need. They purchased a car. They bought cleaning products. They bought 2 spades. They bought 2 washing lines. They bought a duvet. They placed Peter's body into a suitcase. Then they drove the suitcase south across the English border. They dumped it in a lay-by between Otterburn and Belsay in Northumberland. The investigation traced the digital footprint backward through the fake Gaydar profile, through Peter's financial records, through the purchases made in those late August days. Both men were arrested. The prosecution proceeded against them at the High Court in Glasgow and at the High Court in Edinburgh. On August 2nd, 2023, Paul McNaughton pleaded guilty at the High Court in Glasgow to the murder of Peter Koshan and to attempting to defeat the ends of justice. He was sentenced on June 17, 2024, to life with a minimum tariff of 22 years, backdated to August 18, 2022. The case took a uniquely Scottish turn at the trial of his co-accused. On May 17, 2024, at the High Court in Edinburgh, Paul Black was acquitted of murder by a not-proven verdict, a verdict option unique to Scottish law that has since been abolished prospectively under the same 2025 Act. that brought in Suzanne's law. Black admitted attempting to defeat the ends of justice. He was sentenced on the same day as McNaughton, June 17, 2024, to 5.5 years. Sentencing Judge Lord Scott told McNaughton from the bench, "You exploited his illness and vulnerabilities over a period of time before deciding that he must die." While one Edinburgh case revealed how easily a modern catfishing scheme could end in a lay-by across the border, the final case carries us back to Aberdeen in 1978, to a victim who had quite literally predicted her own death in writing to her solicitor. Brenda Page. The final case is Dr. Brenda Page, an Aberdeen geneticist whose own field, DNA, eventually convicted her killer 45 years after her death. Before she died, she had written to her solicitor predicting exactly what was about to happen to her. Her ex-husband walked free for over 4 decades. So how did a woman warn the world she was about to be murdered? And what finally caught the man she had named? Dr. Brenda Page was 32 years old. She was the principal of the genetics department at the University of Aberdeen, a position that put her at the front of a field that was, in 1978, still emerging. She had been married to Christopher Kit Harrison, a Cambridge graduate and former Harvard biology tutor. The marriage had ended in October 1977, when Brenda divorced him, citing cruelty. She had obtained an interdict to keep him away from her. To meet the financial pressures that had followed the end of her marriage, Brenda had also begun working part-time as an escort through Edinburgh's Capital Escorts. On the evening of July 13, 1978, Brenda dined at the Treetops Hotel on Springfield Road in Aberdeen with 2 men. They were there together until around 2:30 in the early morning of July 14th. She drove herself home alone to 13 Allen Street. In the hours that followed, her killer prized open her bedroom window from the outside. He waited, and then he attacked Brenda inside her own bedroom. She was struck at least 20 times on the head and face with a chisel-like blunt instrument. The defensive injuries on her hands and wrists showed she had fought. A friend found her body on the morning of July 14th. Within hours, Christopher Harrison had been arrested and interviewed. He was released for insufficient evidence. He then moved to the Netherlands and lived there for years. The case appeared to be over. What made Brenda Page's death uniquely chilling was something investigators discovered when they reviewed her correspondence. Before her death, Brenda had written to her solicitor saying that if she died suddenly, "Make sure I get a good post-mortem." She had told her own legal representative that she expected to be killed. Could a woman in 1978 really have anticipated her own murder so precisely that she put it in writing to her solicitor? For nearly 40 years, that letter sat alongside an unsolved case. Then in 2015, Police Scotland's major investigation team North reopened the file. They were operating on a different scale of forensic science than the original investigators had ever imagined. More than 500 new statements were taken. The physical evidence had been preserved. A paint flake recovered from Brenda's bedroom window, the same window the killer had prized open in the early morning hours of July 14th, was tested against paint from a mini Metro that had belonged to Christopher Harrison. The paint flakes matched, and the DNA work that followed produced what would become the central forensic finding of the eventual trial. The court was told, as later reported by Scottish Legal News, that one sperm sample was 590 million times more likely to have come from Harrison rather than from any other male unrelated to him. Harrison had denied ever having sex with Brenda at Allen Street. On March 9, 2023, at the High Court in Aberdeen, after a 10-day trial, Harrison was convicted by majority verdict. He was 82 years old. Lord Richardson sentenced him to life with a punishment part of 20 years. He will not be eligible for parole until he is 102 years old, meaning the sentence is in practical terms a life sentence regardless of how the technical eligibility date is described. The man who had moved to the Netherlands had eventually moved back. He had been living, in his last years before arrest, on the very street that he had once shared with Brenda. He had returned just as Police Scotland reopened the file. Investigators have never publicly explained whether his return to Aberdeen was a coincidence or whether he had believed the case had grown old enough to be forgotten. Harrison's appeal was rejected as time-barred when his lawyers missed the appeal court deadline. He has signaled an intention to take his case to the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission. For Brenda's family, the work of a Scottish geneticist had become its own legacy. The field she had helped advance had, decades after her death, finally caught the man she had warned them about in writing to her solicitor. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.